We're continuing our journey through James for our Thought of the Day series here, and I think I want to do the whole chapter, third chapter of James. Let's do all of chapter 3 today. Um, let's dive right on in. Taming the tongue is what my subtitle says. Let's see what comes up today. Not many of you should presume to be teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. If anyone is never at fault, not many of us should presume to be teachers. So this chapter starts with James saying, and of course we've been reflecting like on a devotional level, just on the surface of the things that we're encountering and hearing in the book of James. And so there's a very surfacey something we can take, something that shouldn't be rejected. Like, not many of us should presume to be teachers. Like, the call to be somebody who instructs, who speaks on whatever level. It doesn't have to be like speaks on behalf, thus saith the Lord, but anybody who speaks as a spiritual leader with any kind of, whether it's because of title or posture or claim, to speak on behalf of God, to represent, that's not something that somebody should presume lightly. I think this passage in James does tell us that those people that step into that role, especially willfully, are held to some kind of higher standard, because you speak for God, you represent what God is like. You damage or protect his reputation by the ways that you interpret and walk out the text. And so I think there is a caution there. There's a danger of how easily we should want to be that, how we should presume that. Not many of us should presume to be teachers, because you know that we who teach will be judged. And on some level, this passage always gives me a little bit of, as I get older and older, maybe a little bit of, I don't know if comfort's the right word, but justice. Maybe I'm using justice in an American sense there. Like, God's going to make things right. And there will be people that have a responsibility that will have to answer for. I get emails all the time through the podcast. Hey, Marty, what do you think about this situation? What do you think about this controversial topic? Hey, what about this thing? Things that are really the calls for our local assemblies, our local congregations, our local fellowships. We have groups of people. We have elders. We have boards. We have leaders in these congregations that help lead and direct, and they're going to be held. I always tell people in my response in these emails, like, I don't share my opinion. I have an opinion. I don't share those opinions via email on these issues, because that's not my role. That's not my call. I will not have to stand before God and give an answer for why I taught what I taught and for your congregation. I don't pastor your congregation. I'm not a leader in your fellowship. But you do have leaders who will have to. And so that's their responsibility, and I have no desire to usurp from them. We need to remember when we step into these roles as leaders, and for some of us this scares us when we run away from maybe a calling, an invitation, a beckoning that God is wooing us with. So don't do that either. And yet when you step into this call, make sure we realize the gravitas that comes with this call to be a teacher. I can remember when I was a lot younger, and I was very angry. I was angry because of all the things I was learning. I was angry with Christians. I was very angry with Christians. And I went into my second job as a pastor, the second job I had. And luckily God had given me this really, this mentor who helped me a lot. And I remember him one day, I had actually just submitted my first sermon. He wanted to see it before I preached it. And he started to read it, and he got, 2 or 3 minutes into it, and he kind of slid it back across the desk, and he says, "You got to go rewrite that." And I was so angry. I was like, "Why? Everything in there is true." And he said, "You are so angry." And as we talked some more, he said, "Marty, you can't be angry at Christians. You can direct your anger at the leaders. You can direct the anger at people like me who taught them and led them and shaped them to be this kind of people. But you can't be mad at the sheep. Go ahead and be mad at the shepherds, but don't be mad at the sheep. And that may not be comprehensively true in all places, but that was really good wisdom that I have taken with me throughout the years. Like, don't get mad at the sheep for following their shepherds. You can get mad at the shepherds. Not many of us should presume to be those shepherds, because we will have to give an answer. We will have some sense of responsibility. Now, we can't undo whatever God's going to do. We can't give ourselves too much credit, but we need to also make sure we don't shirk the responsibility that's ours as well. And so a good reflection. And yet, in this context for James, I think James has a unique context. We talked at the beginning of this series. James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He is a Jewish leader of a very Jewish church in a very Jewish context. So this is not like the Gentile church that Paul speaks to and writes to. This is a very Jewish context with a very Jewish church. To put it maybe in more modern terms that we could relate more to, this is a very religious group of people. These are people that know their Bibles. These are people that know what the will of God typically looks like. These are people that are well acquainted with tradition. These are not fringe, new converts. This audience, generally speaking, is an audience that is very familiar with and intimate with the religious conversation. And I think that there's probably this posture that this group of people can take at times that seems like they're the teachers. They're the teachers. They've been around the block. They know. They are the keepers of Torah. It is to them that Torah was entrusted and passed on through their fathers and their fathers' fathers and their fathers' fathers' fathers. That this is, in James, not just talking about the title of teacher or senior pastor or leader, but James talking to an audience that has a general posture of, well, we are the teachers to the world. And James says, be very, very careful. If you posture yourself that way, you're going to have to be a perfect man, he says. We all stumble in many ways. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he's a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. And James says, is that you? Is that you? Is that me? No. So we got to be really careful the way we posture. And I think I think there are plenty of people watching this video coming from Christian circles, coming from evangelical foundations, coming from communities and fellowships where we need to be careful how we posture ourselves. We always get very self-righteous when it comes to truth and the Bible and theology and all the things that the world needs to know. I think a couple videos ago we talked about the in and the out, the lost and the found, playing favorites. And I think we tend to we're in, like we know. And James says, be very careful. Be very careful before you posture yourself in a way that says, I'm the one, I'm the leader, I'm the teacher, I'm the one that speaks on behalf of, I know. Be very careful, because anytime you posture yourself that way, you're going to be held for a stricter judgment. Doesn't mean you're right or you're wrong. James doesn't say you're right or you're wrong. It just says be careful. We should not presume. Be careful. And then he goes on with what I believe is a very relevant, connected train of thought. James goes on, when we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. So you put the small bit, really when you think about the size of a horse, and what the bit that you put in the horse's mouth is able to do. It's a pretty insignificant little piece of equipment that is able to do unbelievable things with this very large beast. Or take ships as an example, James says. Although they're so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Like, consider a cruise ship. Like, I don't know if you've ever walked by a cruise ship and seen the size of these things. And make no mistake about it, the propellers and the rudders on these ships are huge. And yet, in comparison to the size of the ship, it doesn't take much. A very small rudder, a bit in the mouth of a horse, a rudder on a ship. It doesn't take much to change the direction. Be careful, leaders. It doesn't take much. You better not presume to be a teacher, because it doesn't take much. It doesn't take a 2-degree shift to send your whole course, your whole destination, end up in a totally different place. Wherever the pilot wants this ship to go, a very small rudder. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Be very careful about this tongue that says, I know, I am a teacher, I can tell you, I can teach you, I can lead you. Be very careful about the tongue. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of his life on fire, and it itself is set on fire by hell. James says, he starts by saying, be very careful you don't presume leadership. You don't presume to be the teacher. You don't presume to be the one who speaks for God, because the tongue is incredibly powerful. Just like the bit in the mouth of a horse, just like the rudder on a ship, just like a forest fire started by a small spark, the tongue has unbelievable power for good and for destruction. Be very careful what you do with your tongue. And again, I think in James, now please, let's do the same thing. Let's go shallow, surface level, reflect about our world. Let's go deeper, reflect about their world, and then think about our world. Okay? So let's start on the surface. Has anybody been on social media lately? Consider that a digital tongue. Consider what you are able to do for good and for bad with a single post. Consider, I often have to consider how my whole career as a spiritual leader, teacher, pastor could be over with just one frustrated post, the wrong post on the internet. Consider now some of you don't necessarily maybe have to consider those same level of ramifications, and yet consider, and maybe some of you have experienced those ramifications, maybe some of you have made mistakes and you know what that feels like, but consider the power of the tongue. Consider the power of arrogance. Consider the danger of presuming that you are the one that knows. Consider. But then, again, let's go to their world. I think James is talking to this very self-righteous audience. And he's telling them, endure trials, make sure that you're brought up to maturity, be careful about playing favorites, make sure that your faith isn't just something that comes out of your mouth. And now James stays on this topic of mouth. Make sure that our faith is not just something that we hold self-righteously, something that we know, something that we can talk about, something that we're experts in. Make sure that your faith is not just words, but it's also actions. And James is very particular about how those actions are how we treat other people. It wasn't just acts of service. It wasn't just showing up at the church events. It wasn't just, but make sure you're careful about how you view humanity, and make sure that the way you treat humanity has been changed, that your faith is efficacious, that it actually has made you into it's transformed you, it's made you into a different person. And right when you think that James was done talking about, be careful about words, make sure it's not just about words, but it's about actions. James comes back to words again, and James says, and by the way, be careful that your words, make sure that they're not destructive. So in chapter 2, make sure your words aren't empty, because nobody wants empty words. Who cares? In chapter 3, make sure your words aren't destructive. And I hope for all of us who are steeped in our Christianity, mostly in good ways, I would hope, make sure that we don't fall into this self-righteous crowd who loves to spout truth, presume to be teachers, and yet have an empty faith that hasn't changed us. And our words actually do more harm than good. Bits in horses, rudders on ships, sparks starting fires. Be very careful. Why was I driven to do this series? Because I feel like we live in a world, and we just came off of an election cycle last year, and it has just polarized our world. It seems like every election cycle has just amped up and ramped up the polarization, the lack of decency in the way that we talk to each other. And man, COVID, masks, just all of it is an opportunity for us to just set forests ablaze. All of it is, we take every opportunity to presume to be a teacher, to have all kinds of wisdom, the self-righteousness. And yes, it is far larger than just a Christian thing. And yet it seems like Christians are on many days the worst perpetrators of this. Does it seem like that to you? It does to me. As a spiritual leader, it seems like Christians are actually leading the way in the offense rather than leading the way in the kingdom. And you know what a lot of it comes down to is the way we use words. The way we use words. Our tongues, our arrogance, our self-righteousness, usually seen and heard through our tongues and our speech. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in God's likeness. How much of humanity, how much men and women have been made in God's likeness? All of them. So whenever we curse men or women, whenever we curse people groups or that political party, or what we're doing is we're cursing men and women made in God's image. And so James says, this tongue, it's so powerful. And what's funny about it is you'll sing worship songs on Sunday morning, and then you'll slander entire groups of people on Wednesday afternoon. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing. My brothers, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water come from the same spring? My brothers, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water, which sounds very much like Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, talking about how the fruit of the tree, you can tell a tree by its fruit. If we were to listen to the fruit of our tongue, of the fruit of your mouth, what kind of tree would we be looking at, just based on the fruit? And I know that we like to think like, oh no, I say a lot of things without thinking, and I make a lot of mistakes with my mouth, but I'm a good tree. Like, my heart is, well, I think Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, and now James here in James, I think he challenges this. And there are some really cool layers here. I'm not going to get into all of the... I do think that James is making some allusions and pulling on some remez from the Old Testament. I think there's a lot of references here to the story of Noah, because I think part of what this self-righteous crowd is dealing with here for James is the Gentiles. I think part of their self-righteousness is being projected onto these new Gentile believers that they hear about all around the world. And they're kind of like, this self-righteousness is going, I'm not sure how I feel about all these Gentiles in Asia and Asia Minor coming into the church. I don't know how I feel about all this. I think we're disrupting the pure people of God. And James is like, be careful of your tongue. And think about Noah, because they're a part of this story too. I think there's references here to the stubborn people of Israel in the desert. I think there's references to springs in the desert, and a bitter spring, and salt and freshwater springs. I think James is hinting at, you know your Bible so well, I think James says. You presume to be teachers. You know your Bible so well, don't you? Well, let's think about those Bibles and what we ought to remember from our own story. Be very careful. Be very careful. I think we could say the same things to a lot of us Christians. We know our Bibles so well, don't we? Be very careful. Remember what those Bibles tell us. Remember what we've learned from those same Bibles that we know so well. Be careful. Be careful. All right, let's close this up. Who is wise and understanding among you? And I think this kind of circles back to don't presume to be teachers. So let's talk about being a leader. Let's talk about being a teacher. Let's talk about being wise. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in humility, which is the opposite of what he's been warning us against. Be careful about the self-righteousness. Be careful about the arrogance. Make sure that if you really want to be a spiritual leader, if you really want to be a teacher, if you really want to speak for God, make sure it's just bathed and coated and dripping in humility. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. Humility is an indicator of wisdom. Arrogance is an indicator, at best, of intelligence, at worst, of pride. But humility, if you find humility, well, somewhere that tree, the tree that's bearing the fruit of humility, is wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, again, if you have this self-righteousness that provokes envy in you, if you're jealous, and what you really want is your own way, and my own perspective, my own worldview, my own standard, my own metric. If you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom in air quotes. I like how the NIV did that. This is the old NIV I'm reading from today, not the new one. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly. The heavenly wisdom that comes from humility, or it produces humility, right? Humility that comes from wisdom. Heavenly wisdom produces humility, but selfish ambition and bitter envy, that doesn't come from a heavenly wisdom. That comes from earthly wisdom, which isn't really wisdom at all. It's a different kind of wisdom. It sounds intelligent, but it's not wisdom. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. James says, you know what leads to all kinds of disorder and evil? Selfish ambition. Me wanting me and pushing my agenda and my perspective and my worldview and me knowing that I'm right. But the wisdom that comes from heaven, that comes from above, is first of all pure, and then peace-loving. Think about how this is so relevant to how we use our tongues. Which wisdom is driving our speech? Which wisdom is driving our tongues? Which wisdom is using the bit in our mouth? Which wisdom is steering the rudder of our ship? Which wisdom? Earthly wisdom or heavenly wisdom? Because heavenly wisdom is pure. It's peace-loving. Are you using your speech to condemn, to be divisive, or to be peace-loving? It's considerate. I think a couple videos ago, we talked about being curious, having curiosity and empathy. It's submissive. Oh, that's just flat out un-American. Submissive, what? It's full of mercy. Heavenly wisdom is full of mercy and good fruit. Impartial. Again, no favorites. It's impartial. Like you can't pick camps and have your feet set in heavenly wisdom. You can't be like, well, I'm anti that political party. Because true wisdom is impartial. True wisdom listens to find the goodness in whatever is being said. True wisdom discerns in every conversation, in every situation. It sees people, men and women made in the likeness of God, we were told. Peacemakers. It's impartial and sincere. Impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace, who plant seeds of peace, will raise a harvest of righteousness. Peacemakers who sow seeds of peace, who sow in peace, will raise and reap a harvest of righteousness. Whew! Chapter 3. In my mind, a warning, if not a condemnation, a warning to all of us religious folk about where our self-righteous religion, the danger of where it wants to take us. Let's reflect on that. A lot of stuff to reflect on today, and I'll catch you for the next time.